It seems like the frequency of weather-related disasters is increasing. Across the U.S., we're seeing wildfires, tropical storms and hurricanes, extreme heat, extreme cold with snow or ice, and torrential rain leading to a loss of property, life, and livelihoods. What's more, similar extreme events are happening across the globe. These disasters all can have an impact on our food supply and the ability of people to access food. Today, we're speaking with environmental sustainability management expert Betsy Albright, who is an associate professor of the practice at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Betsy's research centers on how policies and decisions are made in response to weather-related disasters. Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series. I'm Norbert Wilson, a professor of public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy and also the director of the World Food Policy Center. Betsy, thank you so much for joining us. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Norbert. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
And let's be honest, Betsy, I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, so I'm excited to get you now. So let's begin with the first broad question. I'd be really interested to learn a little bit more about your research to make sure that our listeners are up to date on it. And I know you really study disasters, but could you explain or expand on what that really means for our listeners?
Sure, happy to. And first, I apologize. I have a bit of a cold or flu, so if I sound a little funny, that's what's going on. So I'm an environmental social scientist who studies the human and social side of disasters. And I ask questions about how climate-related disasters or climate-driven disasters or weather disasters affect communities and households, and how individuals perceive risks from disasters, how they are affected by disasters, how they learn from, make changes, and adapt after disasters. So my work started with my dissertation in Central Europe. I had a Fulbright in Hungary. But from then, I've expanded and moved most of my work to the U.S. context. And our research team and I have done work on flooding and wildfires in Colorado, hurricanes in North Carolina. And I'm also working on a study of the flows of disaster assistance funds from FEMA to communities. And all of this is with or through a lens of equity or inequities and thinking about that across the disaster cycle.
This is really important. And I remember being at a conference with you and learning about your work, and I was struck by what happens after the disaster, and in particular, what happens to availability of food. And I work with a food bank here in North Carolina. And one of the things I know is when there is a disaster, like when Helene hit Asheville, there are real challenges in getting food out to people. Does your work touch on those topics as well?
Yes, I would not say that our work centers on food, but food definitely intersects across all phases of the disaster cycle, from preparing for disaster, experiencing disaster, the immediate response, that food bank getting food out, to long-term recovery and thinking about risk mitigation. And we can think about that, through a number of different lenses, both on the food access side, but also on the food systems agriculture side as well. As I mentioned earlier, I take an equity lens on much of the work that we do. It's really important to recognize that disasters hit unevenly across society, across the landscape, disproportionately. They magnify social and environmental stressors that are already there. Communities with limited access to wealth, limited access to food, who are underserved, rural communities, racialized communities often experience greater impacts from disasters. So disasters occur on top of histories of disenfranchisement. For example, centuries of marginalization of the minoritized Romani peoples of Central Europe. And they've seen great impacts from flooding. And in North Carolina, Black and African American communities whose ancestors were enslaved and suffered land loss through racist systems of who gets access to loans, access to land ownership. And as a result of these systems and processes, communities, families, individuals may live on marginal lands, may not own their lands. Their lands may be more prone to flood risk, may be underserved. Their housing may be more at risk. They may rent and not own, may have less agency and resources to repair their homes, and may have less trust in government and government systems. So really thinking about all of that and then piling on disasters over these centuries of marginalization, disenfranchisement, underinvestment is really critical when trying to disentangle all these processes and develop policy solutions.
This is really fascinating work. And so thank you for laying out the sort of reality of the experience of disasters where people who have been marginalized may have difficulty accessing resources, or there may be some concerns about trust. Broadly, we're interested also in the food system. And I'd be interested to understand how, when disasters strike, do you see effects upon the food system or the food system responding to these disasters?
So recognizing that some individuals have higher food stress even without a disaster. They may have higher pollutant burden because they live next to a concentrated animal feedlot operation. They may have weaker infrastructure systems, electricity, transportation, because of disinvestments. And so when a disaster strikes, pollution loads may increase, access to food becomes even more of a challenge, food stress increases. For example, in North Carolina, across the Southeast, and further in the United States, Latino migrant farm workers face higher risks during hurricanes and floodings because of barriers like limited access to emergency information in Spanish, language barriers, fears about government intervention, fears tied to immigration status, housing conditions, lack of transportation. And these factors can delay access to food, evacuation, reduce preparedness, slow recovery. And yeah, it's a challenge to really think then hard about what policy solutions make sense.
Mm-hmm. And that does make me also appreciate, when we think about some of the folks involved in the food system, that the disruption that a disaster can bring will also mean a loss of employment or opportunities to continue earning income. And that seems to be a sort of a knock-on effect of these disasters. It's not just the immediate weather event, it's all of the other things that follow afterwards.
Yes. Yeah, and so when thinking about policy solutions, I really think it's critical to address these inequities even outside of the disaster cycle or outside of the framing of disasters. And can we think about and develop ways, for example, to reduce the risks of concentrated animal feedlot operations in North Carolina? Are there ways for more resilient and sustainable and local ways of farming that minimize environmental risks, increase wealth, increase jobs, access to jobs, that then when disaster strikes are going to be more resilient because they're more resilient even before disasters? You know, I'd like to see greater investment in areas of food access, strengthening support for farm workers, encouraging development of local food hubs, also thinking about making food access hubs more resilient to extreme weather events, maybe elevating them, getting them all generators or solar microgrids. So when disaster does happen, they're more resilient and then they can serve as community hubs with less reliance on supply chains at the national level, really coming back local, mutual aid, supporting each other, communities supporting communities, non-governmental organizations, government, faith-based organizations, strengthening local food systems. Also, everything that I just said for food, I also think for health. You know, access to healthcare goes along with access to food in terms of critical infrastructure for a community to flourish. And so making sure there are local hospitals, not just in time of disaster, but in time of not disaster. So expedite funding for small businesses, for neighborhood organizations. Neighbors getting to know neighbors. In disasters, neighbors rely on neighbors, and that's critical. So anything we can do to build up networks, and that doesn't necessarily have to be government intervention. That could be faith-based organizations, churches, working with communities. It could be little leagues. There's lots of different ways to help build that social infrastructure that's so critical during disasters.
Betsy, thank you for that. And as I hear you talk about these issues, what I am grateful for is we normally talk about food and the food system, but it's a parallel reality of what happens with the healthcare system when the disaster strikes. I can only imagine if someone is in need of a certain medicine, when the disaster hits, access to that medicine may be called into question, as happens with food. But one of the big things I get out of what you're saying is we need to build resilient communities, not when the disaster happens, but do that work now. How do we create mutual aid? How do we create actual neighborhoods that know what's going on and to care for one another? Because it's that helps us through these difficult times. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's more well said than I said. So yes, thank you.
I am so grateful for this. Betsy, is there anything else we should think about when it comes to disasters and the food system, or how we should prepare for disasters in the future?
One thing that I didn't emphasize that my early work really looked at is how we grow food. And, in Central Europe and Hungary, in the area that I studied, there's large-scale infrastructure on land that had previously, centuries ago, been wetlands and then was drained for large-scale agricultural systems, not unlike what we see in much of the Midwest of the United States. But as climate change worsens, we're seeing more extreme rain events. It's becoming harder and harder to basically fight against these floods in our agricultural system. And so really rethinking what a resilient kind of agroecological system could look like on the food growing side. And that could be issues of what is grown. That could be issues of scale, thinking about maybe we need to put more land aside and not farm, but really thinking hard. And how do we incentivize? How do we set up insurance to help mitigate some of the risks? But I think that's going to be one of the major challenges moving forward.
Betsy, I think this is a critical conversation that we're having to say, how do we adjust our food system and our society in light of these changing risks of disasters? I think this is a great place to stop, but actually it's hopefully a place for future conversations. Our guest today is Betsy Albright, the Dan and Bunny Gable Associate Professor of the Practice of Environmental Management, Environmental Economics, and Policy at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. I want to thank our listeners for paying attention to this podcast, and thank you, Deborah Hill, for producing this podcast. And this is Norbert Wilson.
Thank you for listening to the Leading Voices in Food podcast. This program is an educational series produced by Duke University's World Food Policy Center with the goal of promoting productive conversation for food systems change. If you would like to subscribe, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast app. Transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center.